So we're here for Sleeping with the Vampire because vampires are mysterious and sexy. And every schoolgirl dreams of having a vampire boyfriend these days. And this human-vampire relationship these days is more of a badge of honor than a dangerous liaison. So rather than being damsels in distress, modern ladies share dating tips for fanged friends. On the screen now is just a list of the works that I will be referencing. I expect that everybody here has probably read, but definitely seen an adaptation or two of Dracula. The others may be a bit more obscure, but you'll get some more information as we go along. And here is one of the dating tips from How to Catch and Keep a Vampire. And I think we can all sympathize with that one. So where a few decades ago, scholars called the 21st century vampire rude, boring, and hopelessly adolescent, and feared the end of the genre, vampires continue to dominate popular fiction now as much as ever. And as Clive Bloom says, we now live in an age of international Gothic. This apparent contradiction is, however, an inherent characteristic of the vampire narrative. To write and rewrite the origins of vampirism is not only compulsive in the realm of the undead, it is the key to immortality itself, to live through the narrative. Everything has changed, and yet everything is the same it's always been, because vampires in folklore and early literature have always haunted their loved ones above all others. Yet, once upon a time, that was the stuff of nightmares, the source of terror, and not in any way sexy or romantic. Far more recently, vampires feature disproportionately as a focus in YA Gothic fiction. So what we'll do today is trace some of the vampire characteristics, comparing Dracula to 21st century YA fiction to showcase differences as well as similarities, with a particular focus on the role of women and female sexuality. We'll start with differences, and those start with the vampire character. The folkloric vampires, first and foremost, are reanimated corpses, not so very fresh from the grave. And even Count Dracula from the original novel is not the dandy gentleman that audiences have come to love in the subsequent movie adaptations. I put the full quote on the slide. You don't have to feel compelled to read all of that. This is Harker's description of Count Dracula when he first meets him, and he's not really described as Christopher Lee, is he? His face is strong with a high bridge of a nose, peculiarly arched nostrils, hair growing scantily around the temples but profusely elsewhere. My favorite line, his eyebrows were massive. The mouth, so far as I could see it under the heavy moustache, was cruel looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. So the description from the original novel is closer to the folkloric vampire, but let's ogle at Christopher Lee nonetheless. If our folkloric vampire succeeded in rising from the grave, it was first assault his family, and starting with the widow, moving on to friends and neighbors thereafter. And if it managed to kill basically the entire village, they could move on to another village and take a normal role in society, just as long as they remained undetected as vampires, which is basically why it's always so important for the vampire experts to kill the vampires early. So arguably, Dracula could be one of those vampires who has successfully, I need to stay away from that word, that doesn't work before 3 coffees in the morning, absolutely. But arguably Dracula could be one of those vampires who has killed all of his loved ones and therefore assumed a normal role in society. As he is a member of the nobility in life, he remains Count as vampire, resides in his castle and continues to rule his subjects. He is the source of fear and superstition for the local humans and later on for Van Helsing and the Crew of Life. Dracula, the novel, is thoroughly modern and moves the vampire out of the remote forest and into the heart of the city. Dracula, the Count, is clearly not human. He's the president of an exclusive supernatural club that only he hands out membership invitations for, where works such as Carmilla or The Vampire show their vampire protagonists as members of a declining aristocracy that is the relict of olden days that needs to be eradicated. Dracula, throughout the entire narrative, is a warrior, more than evenly matched to his pursuers and often far more energetic than the vampire experts in the narrative. He is the one who chose his brides. He chooses the victims they can feast on. He chooses Lucy Westenra and Mina Murray. There is absolutely no sign of declining power and influence in his character. And yet, much like the folkloric vampire, Dracula finds his time in his native country slowly running out, and he moves to London. That move is meticulously planned, merging old and new world from the start, where Dracula works with the help of a very modern solicitors firm to procure his new property, but uses the traditional help of Romanian locals to move all of his possessions. Dracula is very much in touch with contemporary life and finds himself a new home in the center of the modern world, London, which at the time was the most modern metropolis on the globe. The Count, at least temporarily, becomes the vampire in the city, choosing to intertwine vampire and human society. This narrative takes the action right into the heart of the British Empire, making its vampire a symbol of reverse colonization. I'm sure most people are familiar with the paper from Steve Narata. So the vampire is more than a monster. He is the empire's guilty conscience, come to exercise his own power and victimize the oppressors of his home country. Now, of course, we know that the city ultimately becomes Dracula's undoing, and he never makes it back to the safety of his castle. While Dracula rules the countryside supreme, the city ultimately gets the better of him. In the enlightened 19th century, humans are still the masters of their society. The supernatural vampire doesn't belong and remains part of a Gothic other that invades temporarily, only to be ultimately defeated. The threat of infection in the guise of respectability that Dracula represents is in the end averted, and Dracula is defeated by the more efficient information systems offered by the modern cities that the Crew of Light use throughout the narrative. The vampire in those Gothic narratives is a tool that threatens to destroy civilization, only to restore their precarious order at the final hour. The vampire can upset the status quo, but not permanently change it. We find echoes of Dracula in very many contemporary YA vampire works. In the 21st century, vampires are part of the city and society. They know how to work this society to their advantage, blending in to be invisible on one hand, while establishing vampires as a ruling class on the other. Like those who came before them, modern vampires go where power is. The fact that 21st century YA vampire literature often puts young women at the center of the stories would seem to suggest a lineage originating from works like Carmilla or Blood of the Vampire. However, the contemporary vampiress has far more in common with the warrior Count than with the reluctant killers that are Camilla or Harriet. Even if the protagonists are hopelessly adolescents, they are powerful and dangerous predators. Being more sympathetic characters that readers can identify with doesn't make these vampires any less violent, nor does it necessarily confine the narrative to domestic spaces. Modern vampires narrate their own stories, in contrast to Dracula, who doesn't get to say pretty much anything the entire novel. And this new subjective insight essentially destroys the boundaries between us and the monster we encounter. These subjective and articulate undead offer a whole new perspective into Gothic narratives and open up the vampire as a relatable figure. And once the readership can relate to the vampire, it isn't long before the story's human protagonists start to consider the vampire in their lives for romantic potential. And that has undeniably led to quite a number of vampire romance narratives, but it would be wrong to assume that all Gothic YA stories only use the vampire as a Byronic hero love interest to a human teenage girl. If you bear with me 1 second, I'll just have a drink before the voice goes. Let's start looking at modern YA then. Excuse me. In contemporary literature, the vampire becomes the link to connect to history and tradition that was missing from the teenager's life up to that point. In Melissa Dela Cruz's Blue Blood series, the vampires are presented as very modern and very rich kids in American society's ruling classes. They are born vampires, but their vampirism doesn't manifest until puberty. It is their blood that is alive in an ever-changing human shell. Vampirism here equals finding the meaning to life. Unlike humans, vampires cannot find meaning in creating and nurturing offspring, and family, in the sense of a traditionally conservative nuclear family, has no meaning. Instead, the vampire community becomes a reassuring constant. There's a finite number of vampires, and their lives alternate between experiencing life in a human body and a vampiric rest to achieve a sort of ascension that suggests some Hindu concept of reincarnation, but I'm afraid it's never really explored beyond the suggestion, which I thought was a shame, because that sounded really interesting. By becoming vampires, the teenagers connect to a past that traces back to Southampton, England, and moves to America on the Mayflower. But it is hinted that the vampires are much older when one of them recalls she had always been there for him, Agrippina to his Valerius. Again, that is more of a suggestion that isn't really explored in the narrative. But much like Dracula, these vampires find a new home in the new world and literally set sail for it. Rather than being a narrative of reverse colonization, though, these vampires are in fact the colonizers. While the process of European colonization has been a horror story for many of the world's indigenous people over the past few hundred years, Blue Bloods completely fails to make any reference to Native American people altogether. Casting its vampires in the victim role, Blue Bloods ignores the vampire's impact on the existing population. For the vampires in Blue Bloods, East isn't Dracula's Eastern Europe, but England, which is of course Western European context, so we're getting a bit meta. But the England that is the very center of the modern world for Dracula is a place of danger and prosecution for the Blue Bloods. And like Dracula, they proceed to travel westwards to find freedom and opportunity and safety And like I said, without any consideration for the people who are already in America. We would have, because there's a bit of a thematic break, we would have a moment to take questions, or I can just carry on after I've had another drink. So modern vampires, it seems, don't need humans to connect with the contemporary world, much in contrast to what Louis tells us in the Vampire Diary. Interview with a vampire. Why am I calling that a diary? It's an interview, not a diary. Instead, vampires need rules to deal with the nightmare vision of the modern world. They need a past never to be forgotten, so they can branch out and explore the ever-changing human society. It must be noted, though, that both Blue Bloods and the House of Night, which I'll get to in a moment, it isn't the Gothic elements that disrupts those teenagers' lives. On the contrary, as vampires, they exit broken structures and find stability in vampirism. As such, vampires don't rely on family in this society. They build new societal structures and surrogate families. The America that was on the economic rise and a threat to the empire in Stoker's time has now taken its place as a world power. And the vampires in its midst are a natural, though definitely dominating part of that society. Moreover, contemporary fiction shows vampires closing together in urban centers, building communities, and constructing ties of friendship. So let's move on to the House of Night. I apologize for the small picture. I tried to find one that shows all of the covers, and there's just too many of them to make that a good picture. So the House of Night series by PC and Kristen Cast can broadly be described as Harry Potter with vampires. The human teenagers are marked to become vampires. It's not specified what causes that change, but once they're marked, it's inevitable. To ease the transition, the kids are called to a boarding school, the so-called House of Night. And in this semi-secure environment, their fledgling vampires are introduced to Wiccan traditions to allow them to accept their change as natural and connect with elements of nature. Vampires come into their power over time at the House of Night. Again, a parallel to the Vampire Chronicles, where Laura Dividal observed, monstrosity isn't instantaneous, but rather constructed, and vampires have a normative system. For the House of Night, the normative system that provides a framework for correct vampire behavior is Wicca. And as the vampire's narrator, Zoe, finds herself in the midst of a revisionist witch myth at the heart of modern Wicca. Much like the Hogwarts in Harry Potter, the vampire finishing school House of Night becomes a surrogate home for the fledgling vampires. They feel their return to it. It's not a hated boarding school. No longer a vampiric invasion to illustrate the vulnerability of a single-parent household, the vampire community instead becomes the antidote to that single-parent household and patchwork families that have become obsolete as support structures. Now, of course, the school's safety is as much an illusion as the idea of female-centered old ways witchcraft has been proven to be a false history. We're into racist territory again, I'm afraid. Sidelining the Native American heritage of our main protagonist, Zoe, even while claiming to connect to Native American heritage, the fledgling vampires finds a home in the very European Christian traditions that fostered the idea of a primal goddess belief system which never existed. This adds another layer of otherness to the vampire, who is now also a skilled practitioner of natural magic. For one, that presents a justification for the boarding school setting, aligning it again with the Harry Potter series. But this plot device also adds to the mythology by aligning the vampire with the witch. The author's use of the witch clearly intends her as a feminist figure that justifies female power. Power that the fledgling vampire feels quite at home with and therefore entitled to. In addition to the cultural heritage, the vampire is also removed from the original human's ethnic heritage. And Zoe is literally whitewashed into a pale predator to match what European vampires have been portrayed as through the ages. This painful racism finds a predecessor in various 19th century works. I'm going to use The Blood of the Vampire as an example, where vampire Harriet is also described as colorless, despite her Jamaican heritage. Now, in Harriet's case, the pale skin is a double bluff. Harriet believes herself to be English, merely born and raised in Jamaica. And to her acquaintances, the pale skin seems to prove that claim. Yet as readers, we soon learn that Harriet's mother was in fact a black slave, whose own mother was bitten by a vampire bat during pregnancy. And so the pale skin hides her colored ancestry while displaying the vampirism, turning Harriet into the predator that can pass for just another human. Similarly, Zoe in the House of Night finds herself othered in a human context by her Native American ancestry, something that's clearly denied by her mother in an attempt to fit into the mainstream society. She is then othered out of human society completely by turning into a vampire, but that's the very thing that removes any sign of her ethnic otherness. In both House of Night and Blue Bloods, vampirism, with all its inherent and invented mythologies, signifies a longing for roots that modern American life can't provide. Newfound things become the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And the otherness of vampirism rescues rather than destroys these transitioning teenagers. Vampirism is attributed an ever-increasing long history with each work, establishing the Fang contemporaries as the oldest possible wisdom in the narrative. So it is crucial that these fledgling vampires are teenagers, and the vampire state mirrors the liminality of the teenage years. The big changes they experience develop a much deeper meaning than simple human puberty would, as awakening sexual desires are replaced, or rather combined with, awakening bloodlust. And yet, it's that very bloodlust that reconnects these modern vampires to their human contemporaries. Now, the first rule of blood drinking in contemporary society is that the human must not be harmed. In contrast to vampire folklore and earlier literature, modern vampires have to respect human life as a valuable source of nourishment, which does make sense. I mean, there's very few works that have explored the issue that would arise, vampires running out of human blood. So, in other words, it's again the vampire society itself that imposes the rules of engagement to ensure its continued existence here, possibly also angling for acceptance in human society. So vampires construct their own normative system to perform their own monstrosity within its limitations. In Blue Bloods, the vampires cultivate a number of relationships with human familiars, and a rota ensures that no human suffers blood loss unduly. whereas in the House of Night, they take a more established route of using blood banks with human donations, while fledgling vampires taste each other's blood until they are grown up and can control their bloodlust. Modern vampires are humanized, but while they are no less predatory in nature than Dracula was, it's their own rules that restrict them to a socially acceptable rule. However, that should suggest that modern vampires are caring, lovable creatures. When scholars write, postmodern vampires rarely stay silent for long, this can refer to the vampire narrative overall, as much as to the monster inside a temporarily domesticated vampire protagonist. I'm going to pause here for a minute, take a drink, and if anybody has questions, we could take them now or move on. So let's stick with the modern vampires. For every part of scary vampire tradition that's held in check, a part of scary teenage behavior is substituted. Aside from the vampires at the center of the narratives, the story largely focused on realism and social issues. In both the House of Night and Blue Blood series, you find one not so open to all elite within the elite. And the ladies in charge of these are more than just mean girls. In Blue Bloods, you have the indomitable Mimi Force, whose one goal in life was to make everybody else's miserable. Again, possibly my favorite sentence from that book. She's the queen of the social circle that every vampire who wants to be anybody wants to be in. And her very name radiates power. In the House of Night, you find the Dark Daughters, which is a sorority. And those not in the club refer to it as hacks from hell with as much disgust as jealousy. Even in How to Catch and Keep a Vampire, readers are invited to join a secret society of vampire initiates by wearing a red ribbon that defies equality. The story's main protagonists are not initially, and some never become, part of the in-crowd. The elite within the elite is, however, the stage where the story plays out. In both House of Night and Blue Bloods, there's a distinction between good and bad vampires. The main protagonist in Blue Bloods, who's called Skylar, sorry, I realize I haven't actually mentioned the name previously. Skylar never becomes part of Mimi Force's elite group, but that doesn't stop her from befriending Mimi's equally trendy brother, leaving all her prejudices about rich, trendy teenagers behind. Skylar is a bit of an odd character in that she's designed to not really be part of the rich crowd, but basically she is, because she goes to the same elite high school. Basically, her family is portrayed as the ones whose wealth has run out, but clearly not entirely. So she still lives in a penthouse on Fifth Avenue and all the rest of it, like all of her peers, but isn't quite part of the group. Now, in the House of Night stories, Zoe not only takes over leadership of the Top Daughters very quickly and tries to turn it into a friendly and inclusive sorority, she also seeks to understand and support the Dark Daughters' former leader by the delightful name of Aphrodite, and thus lives the second chance motif. Even vampires make mistakes, or in the words of True Blood's American Vampire League, vampires are people too. So both Skylar and Zoe are presented as classical female demons defined by action rather than passiveness. Same as we find in classic Gothic novels. Unsurprisingly then, one thing that contemporary teenage vampires definitely have in common with Dracula is their predatory nature as sexual partners. Yes, we're about to enter that part of the conversation. When the human protagonists admit that vampires' desirability as romantic partner, what they don't acknowledge is the fact that the vampire's very desirability is part of their predatory nature. Vampires are attractive to attract their victims. The human partner never has a choice in the matter, and they remain victims despite changes in the circumstances. Indeed, the close relationship of sexual desire and predatory behavior, the allure of carnality and cruelty, is an established vampire trope, reaching from the earliest vampires in literature, such as Heinrich August Ossenfelder's Der Vampir, and Berger's oft-quoted Leonore via Dracula, which of course does quote Leonore, all the way to 21st century YA. The teenage vampires in contemporary YA discover sexuality at the same time as they discover their own vampirism, and they build sexual partners, human as well as vampire, into this new world as they go along. Awakening sexuality in contemporary works takes a shape very similar to Victorian times, as the forced fellatio motif found in Dracula and very heavily discussed by scholars over the years from Dracula, it appears again in contemporary YA. The recurrence of this motif doesn't mitigate the forced violent nature of the incident. However, while the perpetrator is still a vampire, that vampire is now female. In Blue Bloods, the ceremonia osculor, or blood-sharing ceremony, has much the same function as in Dracula, that is, to bind the human to the vampire. And like Victorian times, the human has no choice. The female vampire is sexually aggressive, chooses her partner, and sets the pace for the relationship. 21st century YA literature continues to present female vampires as overtly sexual beings, making the woman vampire beautiful and seductive in much the same way as Le Fanu presented Camilla. These young women are neither what Twitchell describes as adolescent male fantasy, nor can any man deprive woman of her sexuality in these works. All the female characters, not just the main protagonists, claim a right to a sex life, which is a development that Dracula's Mina predicts in one of her diary entries. I suppose the new woman won't condescend in future to accept. She will do the proposing herself. The forced fellatio motif also appears in House of Night, where Zoe repeatedly tries to undo a blood tie she somewhat accidentally created with her human ex-boyfriend, while her longtime nemesis, the aforementioned Aphrodite, tries but fails to claim the same power. And the main difference is that Aphrodite chooses a male vampire as her partner, who is able to resist her inherent vampiric power, end the relationship, and choose a new partner, regardless of Aphrodite's wishes. On the other hand, Zoe's ex-boyfriend is a human, so he's unable to withstand her vampiric allure. Nonetheless, both of these women are shown as sexual predators who won't stop to ask consent or accept rejection. What this shows is the crucial difference between the stages of human or vampire as partners. While the human familiars are more respected than the victims of old, they remain essentially a source of nutrition, possibly a servant, but they are the ones who die, even if it is of natural causes. Only a vampire partner can be equal, while human partners always remain devoted victims to their vampires. However, this human devotion is not without its perils. One is obvious, namely the human could be drained entirely of their blood and die. But what we also find in this House of Night work, the episode between Zoe as the vampire and Heath, her human ex-boyfriend, shows how unpleasant this devotion can be for the vampire. Heath acts like a typical stalker who will not leave his former partner alone. He tracks Zoe down to her new school, despite the fact that she's long broken up with him, and he's determined to be with her and virtually forces his blood on her. This is how the blood link gets accidentally created. Zoe has to assume an authority far beyond her years and far beyond her vampiric abilities to rescue Heath from a danger that she knows she poses. And it is crucial that it's her choice to spare him. Heath would quite literally die for her. I'm just going to take another drink. So I've got energy for the next section. What is striking is that all couples, regardless of the human vampire constellation, are mixed sex couples. Dracula, it has been said before, is reassuringly heterosexual, and that's another trait that 21st century American YA literature repeats with their vampire stories. Even though the House of Night series features a gay teenage boy as one of its central characters, Damien is portrayed as essentially one of the girls. In fact, he does join the Dark Daughters. He joins in their girly chatter about the school's heterosexual males, and he's a trusted confidant rather than a potential partner. He never has a partner himself, and not even a serious love interest, poor sort. Damien is the focal point of their circle of their 5 friends. But he's shown as the smartest of them, who always provides factual, historical, and scientific knowledge to underpin whatever the group is dealing with. And that in itself is likely the explanation for his gay character status. He's a figure of authority to the young women without actually being in a position of authority, because he's just a teenage boy like they are teenage girls. So essentially his character wouldn't work as another young woman. As a female, Damien couldn't be equal within the circle because he is so much more knowledgeable. And as love interest, that same knowledge would mark him as superior in a relationship that is obviously meant to be equal. The whole Damien character only works with him being gay and being a boy. So all contemporary romantic couples remain reassuringly heterosexual as those in Dracula. The same applies to Blue Bloods, where you don't even have a vaguely interesting gay character to discuss. So I won't go into further examples for that. What we don't find as a trait in vampire relationships is exclusivity. In part owing to the constant need for blood, vampires in 21st century YA, just as well as in Dracula, change partners frequently and often maintain more than one relationship at a time. It seems almost unremarkable to see the Count live with 3 women and then stalk 2 more in quick succession upon his move to England, while the human men are limited to 1 female partner or don't have any at all. That feature becomes even more striking as there's a hint of promiscuity in contemporary YA literature, where the female protagonists also claim the right to have more than 1 male partner, a desire that was so rigorously denied to Dracula's Lucy Westenra. Partners in contemporary YA are awarded different types of status, though, and mostly it's the bloodlust that necessitates varying human male donors, while the love interest is restricted to 1 partner. What is also interesting is that the female main protagonists in contemporary works, so Zoe in House of Night and Skylar in Blue Bloods, are represented as social outsiders, while simultaneously they are special and attract the attention of the most desirable male vampire around. The women are outsiders at their human schools, just as they are special in their respective vampire circles. Zoe is in House of Night presented as a first year who, within weeks of starting school, has almost full vampiric power, whereas Skylar in Blue Bloods is the vampire who cannot exist in the world of Blue Bloods because she is new, she is a child born from a vampire mother rather than a reincarnated vampiric soul. Both of these women find themselves attracted to and attracting a male vampire of significant social status that they themselves regard as unobtainable and expect to be shallow. So the narrators couldn't scream their message any louder. We're all special little snowflakes. And the popular guy isn't as shallow as you think he might be. It is, in fact, those very popular vampire boyfriends who help the female protagonist figure out the various dangers in their unusual surroundings and keep them grounded. As the vampires start to attend high school, prom and other school dances become a feature of the stories, and music gains a narrative importance. And so this would be your last chance to have a break before I get to the end of this is the last section. Do we want to have a break? All right. So let's talk about music and vampire literature. Dracula, as far as we know, doesn't have a favorite song. But later vampire narratives show themselves very heavily influenced by contemporary music. So, for example, Poppy Z. Bright's writing is heavily influenced by Nine Inch Nails, and an awful lot of 21st century vampire stories specifically mention Muse. I think the Twilight series is what started the trend of interweaving Muse songs specifically in the narrative, and even more prominently the films, due to the author's preference for the band. Muse is obviously not an unknown band that needs the re-endorsement, but who can blame the author for writing her own favorites into the story? And maybe bestowing an extra bit of immortality there. That does, however, hold the risk of dating the work. It's not easy to keep up with the latest trend and still recognize the trend that doesn't disappear next week. Musical influence on the vampire narrative follows the journey of Gothic and popular culture in general by going more mainstream than alternative as different authors contribute to the genre. Muse, however, keeps resurfacing in contemporary Gothic stories, much like the vampire does. The songs feature in Twilight, Vampire Diaries, and it is specifically a Muse song that Skylar and Jack in Blue Bloods dance into a trance to. That song, that dance, that trance is key to finding out the history of Skylar being not a reincarnated vampire soul, by the way. So the music has significant narrative importance. There's nothing particularly vampiric in Muse lyrics that I could find, but the music seems to have struck the perfect balance between the author's generation and the teenage readers. Right at this moment in time, all readers know what the author refers to when they're using Muse songs. The songs are young enough to appeal to the teenage audience and timeless enough to reel in the adult authors and not so teenage readership. Rock and love songs appear as the perfect combination for any vampire couple, and the music is as much a contemporary feature in YA vampire literature now as the train schedules were in Dracula. It will be interesting to see what future readers and academics make of that development as the stories and those songs age. So To sum up, in 21st century YA literature, the vampire is used to much the same effect as Dracula. The romantic tales are spiced with an erotic subtext that might appear out of place anywhere else. The stories achieve a task of combining romance and sexuality, where Twilight's Bella still agonizes if moving on to another boyfriend is an option at all. Zoe and her fellow vampiresses demonstrate just how normal that actually is. Equally, the ladies accept sexuality as part of a normal relationship. They may not rush into it and expect a committed partner first, but they're not damsels in distress fearing for their virtue. They know what sexuality entails and choose when and how it happens. They are the very embodiment of contemporary society that expects everybody to find their one true love, while simultaneously sexualizing everything from fashion to yogurt. They emancipate themselves from patriarchal as well as parental boundaries. Having no family left of his own, Dracula claims the wives of his English acquaintances as victims, thus presenting himself as a monster of legend that destroys families. In contemporary vampire fiction, families are often already broken. Parents tend to be dead or absent, and divorce is a common feature. The teenage kids in transition to becoming vampires are left to their own devices. Their friends become a surrogate family, and vampirism is their safe haven. Thus, the vampire isn't a family destroyer anymore, but rather the source of a new family. The female protagonists take a leading role in these new families. They are always outsiders who are special amongst their peers. Modern vampire fiction favors female narrators, which is the most noticeable difference to Dracula, but even Dracula is dominated by the women in the story. So even that feature hasn't really changed. And with any adjustments for social and cultural changes over the centuries, the stories become mirrors of their own time and tell similar stories in very similar ways. Thank you very much for listening.